Paola Harris has been working on UFOs since 1979. She's done some breakthrough interviews with a number of leading whistleblowers, including the legendary Philip Corso, a lieutenant colonel that was one of the first to report about reverse engineering projects concerning extraterrestrial technologies.
You're listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
Well, welcome, Paola, back to Exopolitics Today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. There's a lot of exciting things going on, Michael, that we can talk about, but we're going to talk about the past.
Well, we're talking about the past, but a lot of that is now relevant because now people are finally paying attention to whistleblower testimony. And of course, there was a Disclosure Project press conference that Stephen Greer organized, and he brought forward a number of whistleblowers. But the one that's really captured the public's attention is David Grush, who has been given extensive exposure. But all of them really bring this issue of extraterrestrial technologies that have been reverse engineered into the public limelight. So, why don't you tell us about how you got to first learn about some of these UFOs being reverse engineered extraterrestrial technologies?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What the current exopolitics news and UFO news is that it's okay to talk about it now. There's less ridicule. I agree with that. But I have a certain amount of frustration because I already knew and was working with whistleblowers. And the one that was the most important, Michael, was Colonel Philip Corso. Colonel Philip Corso was Army. He was retired Army colonel, and he had a background that was incredible. He was the head of intelligence in Rome in 1945. He was at Fort Riley, Kansas in 1947 when he said there was a cargo in the veterinary quarters that had an extraterrestrial that he saw. In fact, he testified to that in Italy. And then somehow in 1960, and remember 1960s, the Kennedy administration, he was asked by General Trudeau to back engineer artifacts that the Army had. And the reason I keep saying Army is because I'm sure the Air Force had artifacts too, since the first crash that Jacques Vallée and I testified to was 1945. So Colonel Corso used to tell me, he said, look, Trudeau said that the last one alive in research and development was to tell the truth, to tell what we were doing. In other words, they had a file of artifacts from Roswell that they had gone out to big companies and asked the companies to look at these things, and included microchip, fiber optics, high tenacity fibers. He told me individual stories about them, Michael, and he said he also had German scientists with him, and he would go to something like Monsanto, show them the fibers, and also the night screening vision device they were doing. And that was, he said, the cover of was like a lens from the alien body that was a light collector. He explained to me how they peeled it off and then used that lens, and we're playing around with it at the Pentagon. So these artifacts that he had were in 1960. I keep reminding everybody of that because it was the Kennedy administration. The things you should remember is he was working in intelligence, so he briefed Bobby Kennedy. So if Bobby Kennedy knows, Jack Kennedy knows. And they wanted to, he said the reason why they were doing this is they wanted to have more power with competitive edge with Army contracts. And it was done on a cash basis. He told me it was done on a cash basis, so there was no paper trail. Because in the United States, you know this as much as I do, a lot of people came after Colonel Corso, called him a liar, did not believe anything. And I sent you all his military records, so you know that he said and did what he said he did, and the places he said he was. His military records show that he was in Germany. It shows that he was at Fort Riley, Kansas. It shows that he was in Rome. He was the head of the CIC. That was the precursor to the CIA. So the man, apart from having been a contactee himself, was brilliant. And I was lucky enough to be the journalist that was closest to him, all by accident, because I had the room next to him at the Sally Port Inn in 1997 during the 50th anniversary of Roswell. I'll just end by saying one thing. I didn't understand why the secret was secret until I met Colonel Corso. And I realized today it's not about religion. It's not about scaring the general public. It's about the fact that there's money being made off of back engineering, and nobody in these 40, 50 years is about to talk about that, I think, today.
Well, let's talk about how you met with Philip Corso, because I think that's a fascinating story in itself. Now, his book, The Day After Roswell, that came out in 1997, which was the 50th anniversary of the Roswell UFO crash. And so there was a conference, and Colonel Corso, he was really the star attraction, and you got to meet him because everyone wanted to interview him, but Simon & Schuster, the book publisher, were there, and so people weren't able to interview him, but yet you got to do it. So how did that happen?
Well, it's all synchronicity, like my whole entire life. It's all by accident. I was sent from Italy. I was working in Italy. I didn't come back from Italy until 2007. But in 1997, my boss, Maurizio Baiada, whom you know, sent me to cover the story. And everybody in the world was there, from John Mack and Whitley Strieber, Linda Howe, Bud Hopkins, you name them, everybody was there. And I didn't want to do the story because I wasn't prepared. I didn't read the book. I didn't even know what Colonel Corso looked like. But there was a fax that came in that said that from Boulder that said they would take me there. So it was a last minute thing, Michael. And it's from Boulder. It's over, 13-hour drive. It's so long. And we got there, and I didn't have a place to sleep. And when I went to the media center there, the press center, they said to me, well, good luck, because this has been booked. Everybody in the world is here, and all their fans since February. This was in July 4th, 1997. What happened was they said, just open up the phone book and try to get a place. And I opened up the phone book, and my finger went on the Sally Port Inn, which is, on Main Street there. And I called them, and they had a room for 3 nights. And I didn't know it at the time, but the room was right next to Colonel Corso. And what happened was there was a press conference there, and I was in the middle of everybody, and all the people had asked questions, and I hadn't read. I didn't have any knowledge of what was going on, but a blonde man came up to me, and he said, "You're from Italy," because I had a press badge, and I said, "Yes." He said, "Ask my father a question." In Italian, and it was his son, Phil Corso Jr. And I said, well, I'm embarrassed. I don't want to do it. So he took his hand and he pushed me in the middle of the crowd with all the cameras. And I asked Colonel Corso about the Santilli autopsy footage, because we had been discussing it in Italy. In fact, we had put it out on our major channels. And Corso looked at me and he said, well, he said, I saw that. He said, that looked familiar, because when they peeled off the lens from the being's eye, he said, we had that as part of the artifacts, and we back engineered. Now, we is still the Army. Remember, back engineered night screening devices, he said, for the soldiers in Vietnam. We're dealing 1960 here when he had that, those artifacts. So I realized, and then he said, I want to speak to you. I have something to tell you. And I thought, how's that going to happen? I mean, nobody could get to him. And so when I saw him coming out of the room next door, I knew, and I said, can you talk to me? And he said, yeah, I'll come tomorrow at 7:00. That was early in the morning. I'm going to give you 3 books for my friends in Italy, because he said I was, there during World War II. He had a book for Rapanelli and had dedicated them all. But when he sat down to talk to me, he gave me an interview that I didn't want to print. And I wanted just to print the back engineering story. I had the opportunity to invite him to Italy twice. He spoke in Italy in Pescara in 1997 and 1998 in San Marino, which is an independent republic. So what happened is Corso did most of his speaking and most of his meeting of scientists and so forth in Italy because of all this synchronicity.
You got to spend time with Philip Corso, and you obviously got to learn a lot more about what he was doing at the Army's Foreign Technology Desk, which he headed up for that 2-year period during the Kennedy administration. So that's a very important point that you already mentioned, that he was briefing Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General at the time, about what was really happening with UFOs, because the CIA weren't telling the president and they weren't telling him. So they got Corso to come in and give briefings to Robert Kennedy. And as I recall, Paola, I mean, he gave those briefings, I guess, for the 2 years that he was still active. I think he was active in the Kennedy administration from 61 to 63. And so maybe you can say a little bit more about what it was that he was telling Robert Kennedy and President Kennedy about the foreign technologies that they had recovered from Roswell, and that they were kind of like reverse engineering.
He never went into detail because Colonel Corso was very careful. I mean, he was the head of intelligence, but he had a dislike, I'm just going to say dislike, for Jesse Jesus Angleton, who was the head of the CIA. And if you read Kennedy's letters to Angleton, and I know of Angleton because of the Michael Wolff case. It was Jesse Angleton that found Dr. Michael Wolff and sent him to Princeton. Angleton was into UFOs very much. And I saw a letter that Kennedy had asked that he be directly briefed on UFOs by Angleton. And that was not a friend of Colonel Corso's. So he never told me details, except he said, and actually I think I have film. We filmed him at the hotel in Rome where Colonel Corso talks about going to Bobby Kennedy and talking about this. Well, if Bobby Kennedy knows, Jack Kennedy knows. And not only that, I mean, I have to laugh at, who really knows. They all knew. I'm convinced all the presidents knew. It's just that they couldn't do anything about it. I don't know how far Kennedy had asked Angleton for the files directly because he was curious. And I know Michael Wolff had met Kennedy himself. So, the thing is, it's really amazing because for me, in my research, Michael, I turned the corner there because I couldn't understand the secrecy. And if you want to, then when I understood it, the big top companies had these artifacts and it had gone to the military industrial complex. And you remember Eisenhower's warning there, then you can't touch it because it's money making. It isn't like it has to do, and it's also, if you study Richard Dolan's work, you know that the deep black projects, they're very hard to get the real story. What shocked me about Corso, apart from his There I see him in that picture. I have the tie that he's wearing right here. He gave me his tie. And he said to me, look, he said, Paula, he said, I'm telling you, this is real. This is back in 1980 where nobody's thinking about this. He said, this is real. He said, I won't be around for very long. I would like you to keep talking about it. He said, you're one of my soldiers. And I said, I'm not a soldier. I'm a woman and I can't do it. And he said, yes, you can. I will be sitting in the front row when you lecture about it. He said, but you must tell the world. He said, because I'm doing it for my grandchildren and my 3 grandsons. And that was his motivation. Now, our own researchers that were all jealous of this were thinking he was making tons of money, but he kept telling me that, Colonel Corso kept telling me, the world can handle it. They can handle it. The young people can handle it. So he kind of gave me the mandate to keep going. Me and Adriano Forgione, with whom I worked, he gave us the kind of the mandate to keep doing it. So we translated Corso's original manuscript, The Dawning of a New Age, in Italian. And what the Americans were going was, there's mistakes in the book. Well, of course, Corso never was in Roswell. He was at Fort Riley, Kansas. So yeah, mistakes were made by his co-writer. And so when you get one mistake, everybody cancels everything. It's happening with Trinity. It's ridiculous. The mistakes with the book, because the book came from the original manuscript, we just printed the original manuscript, which is called The Dawn of a New Age. And if you want to go to the original manuscript, I think Open Minds has it on their website. And those are his exact words. And the Colonel never lied.
One thing that is very significant here is that Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso was probably the most highly credentialed individual to come forward to say that, yes, we have extraterrestrial craft that have been retrieved and that they're being studied in various corporations, and they're being reverse engineered, and Army intelligence and other military intelligence are involved in that. So he was saying that in 1997, and of course, you know, people are coming forward and saying the same thing. But he was definitely one of the very first to do that. And your kind of interviews with him, your conversations with him, you also have a book about that. I think it's Conversations with Colonel Corso. So,
Yeah.
you know, why don't you tell us about the book?
Yeah, well, you know, when I do any kind of work, whether with a whistleblower or not, I have to have a tape recorder because I can't remember anything. And if I make a mistake, I get in trouble. So it's all tape recorded. It's got a different cover, what's on Amazon right now, but it's all tape recorded interviews. It's called Conversations with Colonel Corso, and it has his military records in it. Because I'd be sitting in a car with him and he'd be telling me things that I would not remember. So when I took the audio tapes, I just transcribed them all. And that's mostly my work. Even my new book, Connecting the Dots, is all audio tapes of what the actual source told me. And I got to get the dates right. I've got to realize, and people that are listening to this, please realize that you have to look at disclosure in a historical context. I mean, people think of Colonel Corso, but they don't remember it's 1960. And it would be stupid if some other branch of the military were back engineering starting with 1945. And so the thing is, you have to look at the context of the chronology of all of the history of ufology. So what shocked me, Michael, and it's in this book, was when he first talked to me, I was, you know, it's taken me a long time to get to contact talking about ETs and everything. I was just black and white, nuts and bolts. That's how I'd been trained by Alan Hynek. But when I went to interview him, I wanted to know about what he did. Instead, he told me I had contacted White Sands when he was the head of a missile battalion in 1957, and 10 years after Roswell, because he has this theory that the two craft crashed and one ended up 10 years later, and that he saw it. Colonel Corso, a little bit like me, thinks his life was totally guided to do these things and to be part of history. He said that he saw the craft. He went up to the cave. He told me where it was, near Red Canyon. He said that a being came out. I think you've seen the image of the being in the Italian book. And he said the being asked that he shut his radars down. And I said, first of all, I didn't want to hear this because I thought it was crazy. At the time, I wasn't open to a lot of things. And he said he knew that I would be the one to lift the radars, he said, because he said, would you shut down your radars? And he said, we had been told to shut down our radars during the day at certain times. He said, so he called the military man, had the radars shut down, but he said to the being, if I do this, what do you have to offer me? And the being said, would you like to come aboard? And he said, what I have to offer you is a new world if you can take it. And those words have been used by all my colleagues, but they come from Colonel Corso talking to the being. So here he is dedicating a book to me. Actually, he wrote it on a napkin too. He said, what do you think a new world if you could take it means? And I didn't even want to go there. I said, I have no idea. He also asked the being if he was a friend or a foe. And he asked me, what do you think he answered? And I said, he answered neither. I'm not your friend and I'm not your enemy. And Colonel Corso said, that's true. When he saw the being, he pulled out a Beretta. He had a knife always in his boot. He was Sicilian. When we brought him to Italy, we had all the Sicilians come up and meet him. And the man was a very powerful man. And he talked about this encounter, Michael, which was really hard for me because I wasn't going to print it. I wanted the other interview that he gave me on back engineering because I thought if I print the encounter, they're going to think he's crazy and they're going to discredit him. Now, I'll never do that again. I've learned a lot. But this was 1997. And he had since given that testimony to Bigelow, to Jacques Vallée, to other people. He was not embarrassed to say he was contacted. And also for him, he looked at his work career with a little bit of regret and wanted to kind of change things so that we could develop a new science, a new way of thinking, and accommodate kind of a new consciousness to create this new world. I'm only realizing this in the last couple of years. The other thing that some people might be interested in, he believed in reincarnation because he made me stop, and I think I wrote it in the book, the car from Pescara to Rome when he was on our major television station. And he walks out into the field and he says, I was here, I had a battle, I killed somebody here. And it made me look up the history of Cesare Borgia, the Borgias, which were the children of Pope Alexander. And he said, Paula, I remember, and I remember Patton or somebody also remembering their reincarnated selves. So the man was really, really interesting. He encompassed a lot of knowledge, and he said, I was here at a period of history that I was supposed to do this. So for me, it was an honor to be his close friend, and I really, really miss him.
This is, I think, very, very significant because Colonel Corso's testimony, as you said, in the 1990s when he came out, people were wanting to criticize and ridicule and dismiss it. But now, with this new openness, it's worth re-looking at Colonel Corso's testimony because, he was very high-ranking and he was actually in charge of a military facility in the 1950s at Red Rock. I think it might have been White Sands. Maybe you can correct me where
No, it was
Red
but Canyon in White Sands, yeah.
Okay, so he was in charge of a missile facility there. at White Sands, and he had a contact experience, which you just described, which is, itself very significant. But what I think is very, very helpful and for people to know is that, so he was there in the 1950s. He has this contact experience with this gray-looking extraterrestrial, and the extraterrestrial at the end of the conversation said, well, if you turn off the tracking, the radar or the active tracking radar that they have there, I'll be able to leave. So can you do that? And so that was part of the agreement. So I thought that was really very important because it showed that in the 1950s, the US military had various types of electronic radar tracking, active radar technology, directed energy weapons, if you wanted to say, that could actually impede or even take down extraterrestrial spacecraft, and that was in the 1950s. So yeah, maybe you want to talk about that, because there have been a lot of crashes, and people often say, well, if they're coming from other solar systems, how can they be crashing here? I mean, how could that be possible? Well, one of the things is that they're being targeted by these sophisticated radar, active radar tracking systems, and now more recently directed energy weapons.
Yeah, if they listen to Dr. Greer's disclosure conference, I think it was around June 9th, there was a man that worked in the South Pole, and they had directed neutrino weapons. So, I mean, you have to study all of it to connect the dots. Yeah, but also, like in our case, the Trinity case that Jacques and I did, I'm convinced that was meant to be, because that was 1 month after the atomic bomb. And that craft, when it crashed, it was entirely together. There was no debris. There was one panel missing with the angel hair that was strewn all over the desert, but it hit a radio tower. That was a radio tower that it hit. But I have talked to people in New Mexico. I've spent a lot of time in New Mexico. And evidently the radar towers some of them were mobile. You could move them. And that caused a problem. Now, anymore, I don't know whether all this was targeted for disclosure, in other words, if this was a gift to humanity. What is ironic to me is in 2023, we're looking at Tic Tacs and we're looking at high-flying craft, and we don't look back at what was done and who the whistleblowers were in the early days, the real heroes of this, who not only worked in the government and were sanctioned by the government to talk, but the guys who were actually in the programs, like Colonel Corso, who was in research and development, who worked with General Trudeau, who did the Korean War. And Michael Wolff and Clifford Stone, and my God, a list of whistleblowers that spent their whole life before the government, disclosure now, telling the people, look, UFOs are real. It's a complicated subject. Certain people know. I remember blaming the government for everything, and Colonel Corso said, what are you talking about? He said, it changes every 4 years. He said, stop using the word government. And I realized he was right. What government is keeping the secret? Because if it changes, and it's also subcontractors, and it's also the military-industrial complex, we're blaming the wrong people. We're looking at the wrong, thing of secrecy. Colonel Corso was okay with disclosure. The problem was, there was a lot of jealousy around the book, and Colonel Corso, when he died, didn't have enough money. I mean, they didn't make enough money to bury him. So it was not until after his death that the book, because there was a lawsuit against the book. And so it wasn't about money, that everybody thinks everything is about money. Sometimes there are people in history who are destined to tell the truth. And I really recommend that people read books and read the source of the books. And his manuscript is on Open Minds. I think, TV to read his original manuscript, The Dawn of a New Age. If it's the dawn of a new age, it must be a new world if you can take it. In other words, he's looking at the world changing.
Well, these whistleblowers that have come forward, I mean, they are brave, and they also put their credibility and their reputations on the line. So people like Philip Corso, they did actually risk their reputation in coming forward and putting out this information. But as you said, they thought it was much more important for the future of humanity to reveal this. Now, you mentioned some of the other whistleblowers you've worked with, but one of the ones that you also got to interview and befriended Colonel Corso was Command Sergeant Major Robert Dean. So you want to tell us about that?
Well, God bless you, Michael, for mentioning Robert Dean. My God, he was a beautiful person. Robert Dean came to Italy early on because I had invited him and Stephen Greer to a conference, and Robert Dean stayed at my apartment in Rome on Ponte Milvio, and then he stayed at my apartment near the Vatican. And Robert Dean was one of the most articulate spiritual people. He had worked in NATO in Brussels, and he had seen a paperwork that was called the assessment. And actually, we had a copy of that in Italy. And this is in the 60s, because this was the Cold War. So I have to remind everybody, you're looking at disclosure now, but disclosure was happening in the 60s, that's 40 years ago. And he understood that this was the problem, because when these UFOs used to go over East Berlin or Eastern Germany, they thought they were American craft. And when the UFOs used to come over Western Germany, they thought they were Russian craft. So we could have started a third world war. I mean, this is serious. It was serious. So NATO, where he worked in Brussels, was looking at this because they were very interested in UFOs. And later on, Robert, who was very spiritual, talked about beings actually being on Earth that he had interchanges with. He came out as a military man and was an incredible spokesman. Most of these people are military men. I mean, look, Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell actually went to the press club. I was there when he was there and asked that this be taken seriously, and nothing was done until today. So these are serious people who necessarily don't want their own TV shows or money or fame or fortune. They figure what they want is real disclosure, because they really worked in these projects. They really were part of it. And thank you. And he loved Colonel Corso. We invited Robert Dean, Wendell Stevens, Carlos Diaz, and Bill Hamilton to Pescara. He was an incredible researcher, Bill Hamilton. We invited all these guys in the Congress, and Desmond Leslie, who wrote the books on Adamski. The conversation that Desmond Leslie had with Colonel Corso was incredible. Of course, I didn't know anything about Adamski at the time, so when they were talking about him, I had to go do my research later on. But these are important personages that got together in Pescara in 1997 at a conference and exchanged. I mean, they're all serious people. They're all military people. Wendell Stevens, Colonel Wendell Stevens.
Yeah, very important, I think, that we remember these historic whistleblowers that have come forward, because their testimonies were groundbreaking then. They're still groundbreaking now, because as the media today is really fixated on people like David Fravor, Ryan Graves, David Grush, and others that are coming forward now. But we need to remember that the whistleblowers have been coming forward for decades now. And in the 1990s, you were among the very, very few people that would interview these whistleblowers and get their stories and put it out there. And I remember Robert Dean. I did have the privilege of interviewing him once, and he truly was very articulate, and he really kind of like made it very clear that in the 1960s that there was a NATO document called the Assessment, which actually described at least 4 different extraterrestrial civilizations visiting and interacting with the Earth. And he said that one of those civilizations looked so human that they could infiltrate NATO itself. They could infiltrate political circles, and that freaked the generals out. But that was really amazing. And he was saying that in the 1990s. So, the fact that you're bringing that you met these people at that time, that you interviewed them, and that you're keeping their memories alive. And I think it's very important today that we kind of revisit people like Philip Corso, like Robert Dean, and some of the others that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, actually, they stayed at my house in Rome. I mean, my apartment in Rome was where they would stay when they do a conference. So I'd have dinner with them. I had Jesse Marcel Jr. and his family there. So, I'm asking him about when he was 9 years old. I have a wealth of knowledge of firsthand sources. That's why I get so frustrated, because I talk to the actual people. I know what they said, and I just released Connecting the Dots, which has everybody from Hynek to Sitchin to Uri Geller to John Mack and everything, because John Mack also stayed with me. So I did this only for one reason. I feel like I always say I'm Barbara Walters. I just want to archive what they actually said, not what the rumor was, what we think, what their fans say, but what the actual people said. It's historical for me. It's historical data. And yes, I was lucky enough, but then I think to myself, was that luck or is someone pulling the strings here? Because I'm doing the best I can to in chronology, to put all those whistleblowers that I met and talked to keep their stories alive. I mentioned Edgar Mitchell because he was an Apollo 14 astronaut. If you don't take him seriously, who do you want to take seriously? It's and what's his name? God bless him, Clifford Stone. I don't know how many times I was at his house. I don't know, in New Mexico. And he's the one that's talking about having the manual for 57 different races so they could do first aid. He's not making that up. He said there were drawings of these beings. Colonel Corso once said to me, he said, Paula, he said, I believe, he said, that the little gray is a clone. He said, because and the autopsy of the one that he saw for Belvoir is in the book, Conversations with Colonel Corso. It's in there. He compared him to a human. He saw bodies, in other words. And he said to me, but he said, we were terrified in the halls of the Pentagon because we were afraid of who made them. We thought that who made them could look like us, and they would be walking free in the halls of the Pentagon. We wouldn't be able to recognize them. For Colonel Corso to say that, that they were a nervous wreck about that, knew that there are cultures, cosmic cultures that look like us, and are probably among us. So you have to listen to what these very important people say. Look at and also you have to see their records. I mean, I helped publish Clifford Stone's book. I made him talk into a microphone for like 5 days, and I published his book, Eyes Only, and he has his military records. I mean, he was hired as a clerk, and he ends up in Vietnam doing 3 crash retrievals. These are historical facts of really important whistleblowers.
Yes, I agree. I think these whistleblowers are groundbreaking, and it's worth mentioning. I mean, today, because David Grush spoke at a congressional hearing and talked about his kind of like secondhand knowledge of these reverse engineering projects concerning captured extraterrestrial technologies, but he doesn't have firsthand evidence, or he's not a direct witness of this. But you spoke with Clifford Stone, who worked for 22 years with the Army, and he was sent, as I recall, on a dozen crash retrieval missions around the world, where he brought back captured extraterrestrial technologies. And you got to, as you said, you got the book based on his conversations, on his responses to your questions, and that's publicly available. And so people are saying, well, where's the evidence for David Grush's claims? Well, here you have firsthand eyewitness testimony from Clifford Stone that you recorded. His book is out there. So yeah, I think as people are starting to reconsider or look at this issue again, especially concerning the capture of extraterrestrial spacecraft or non-human craft, as they say, that they got to start re-looking at these people like Clifford Stone, Colonel Corso, and others. So yeah, you want to just tell us your thoughts on that?
Well, Clifford Stone, I have to look at dates, because anymore I look at things in chronology. During the Cold War, a lot was going on. I remember what I was doing in the 1960s. I was in high school, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this was all going on. Clifford Stone told me that his first crash retrieval was in Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. And I'm going, 1969? My God, and then Colonel Corso, 1960s, and then, Robert Dean, 1960s. I'm going, okay, what else was going on in the 1960s? And then when we got to the 70s, I went back. I do a course, Michael, for you that I love. It's called Human Type Aliens and the Early Days, and it starts with Giant Rock. It's all the human space brother movement that was there during the time that we had Yogananda, because I think whoever was coming was looking at the New Age movement, and then they stopped with the Betty and Barney Hill situation and went to South America. And Michael, you and I have a background with the South American contactees. They went to the Chilca Desert in Chile. So I'm going, okay, so you got to do a timeline. The 1960s were very important. If Clifford Stone's first crash retrieval that he did, because he's a whistleblower, is 1969. The last one he said was in Georgia. And one thing that he said that was really interesting for the people, and it's not out there, it's in my conversations with him, was that anymore they didn't need to take bodies, that they would leave. If the bodies were dead, they would leave them there, and their own would come and get them the next day. And I said, you have an agreement like that? I mean, you guys have worked out all these years an agreement that they've got enough bodies so you can just leave them out there? And he said, yeah. He said, and he was talking about that. He was, with great respect, right? Great respect, no fear, great respect, just like Colonel Corso said, friend said neither. It's, if I could get the original people that worked and that don't have their own, and I have a bias, that don't do it for fame, fortune, or their own TV show. Poor Clifford Stone was always, I helped him with the book and that he got something from the book, but he was always living in very dire straits there. And I even spent my birthday with him and his wife Han from Vietnam. And when you hear the real people and their real intent, Colonel Corso was real, and his intention was his 3 grandsons. You can kind of, I will support these people, and I guess I've become their voice because they're telling you the truth in a timeline. And again, please look at the timeline for the people that are listening to this.
I'd like to bring up now your most recent book that you co-wrote with Jacques Vallée, Trinity. And right now there is a lot of interest in Robert Oppenheimer, the developer of the pioneer behind the atomic bomb. And so, yeah, you mentioned the Oppenheimer in this book, and you got to interview some survivors who saw a crashed spacecraft back in, I think it was 1945. So you want to tell us about your latest book?
Well, it's so funny because our latest book cover looks like the playbill of the movie, and we did this years ago. I'm wondering what's going on. Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project scientists would go to a place called the Owl Bar and Cafe. It's on the outskirts of the Pan American Highway. It's on the crossroads there. It was the only watering hole, and it had groceries. And behind there was the headquarters of these scientists. So I learned about these two little boys that saw this crash a month after the bomb. But I was in Italy, and my first thought was, why doesn't somebody cover this? They're still alive, And I didn't realize that destiny would have it, just like I end up in next to Colonel Corso, that it would be me, because by the son of the pilot contacted me, the pilot that flew over, and told me about this. And they're not Indian boys; they were Hispanic. They were on horseback. One was 7, one was 9. But the thing is this, that I want to impress on people. When we went there, I started working on it in 2013 when Remy died. Remy was, and I'll be honest about it, he wanted to kind of cash in on this. And I said, no, take me to the place and so forth. So the thing is that everybody knew Remy before me, because Timothy Good went to see Remy, and Timothy Good was one of the best researchers. He went to see him in Gig Harbor. Jaime Maussan went to see Remy. James Fox went to see Remy. But Remy wouldn't disclose where the location was. So when it was time, I went with Jose, who was open to all the questions, but Jose knew the people at the Owl Bar and Cafe. So when I went there, he knew their cousins. He was friends with everybody is, is related to everybody. So I was able to ask about Oppenheimer. I was able to ask about the scientists. They did not know the scientists were scientists. They thought they were salesmen because they carried briefcases that were tied to their wrists. And they wore, in Oppenheimer's case, he wore a hat. And that was the only place they could buy groceries when they came to the Trinity site. So I could do research on a whole background that you see in the movie. And the boys saw Oppenheimer in there. And because Jose used to buy a hamburger for the Owl Bar and Cafe. I mean, you have to do field research. Jose has a photographic memory, can tell you the day that it happened. Not only the date, but it was a Thursday or a Tuesday. I don't know how he got that. Maybe he got it because he had contact. I don't know how he got that. The guy is incredible. And so he was able to tell us the contact that they didn't know what it was. There was no Kenneth Arnold. There was no UFO in anywhere. They didn't even use the word yet. There was no Roswell. Just saw an avocado with the dome on it. And Jose, to this day, and I've been working on it for 10 years, says they were crying like babies. Or when you shoot, he said, a rabbit, and it's dying. Now, for somebody to give me that detail, it's in his mind. He thought they were hurt. He was going to go in there, and then the younger kid starts crying, and his eyes are filled with smoke because of the burning mesquite. Then we go and find 2 other witnesses that were present, not at the crash, but 5 years later, that saw the burnt crash site. Sabrina played with the foil because they had no toys. She said she put it back in the plastic. And she and Faustina, her cousin, would play with the well, they're not fiber optics, they were angel hair. I don't know what it was that was lit up all the time. They decorated the trees with it because there was no electricity. Sabrina had not seen her cousin for about 40 years, and they had the reunion in front of us. And Faustino did not know we wrote a book. He did not know there was a crash. and repeated the same story about the angel hair. So the work was done meticulously. Some of the details, that it may not be perfect, but the fact that Remy and Jose did not see each other for 50 years had the exact same story, because I flew also to Gig Harbor to interview Remy before I got involved with Jose. So, it's an incredible story, but it shows me that you explode an atomic bomb, you catch somebody's attention, and maybe those beings wanted the story told, that we are not alone.
Now, you've been interviewing whistleblowers since the mid 1990s, and before that you were researching the UFO phenomenon. So was it really working with the whistleblowers that kind of brought in this element of personal danger for you? I mean, you mentioned it a little bit, so maybe just say, you personally dedicating yourself to this research, how dangerous was it for you?
Well, I never think about that. It's like doing the work I'm going, and I don't have a stake in the outcome. I'm not making money. It all came from my pocket. Want to donate? They can. I spent all my kids are so angry. I never think about the danger. My kids do. Though. And when I was doing the Michael Wolff case, I had 2 car bombs. I just did a masterclass on Michael Wolff, by the way, go off on 2 different occasions near my apartment in Ponte Milvio. It was only 4 stories, but I didn't understand what was happening. And I was flying to Hartford, Connecticut, and he had been in the CIA, and he was talking to Hal Puthoff, and he was all involved with, Stubblebine and Inman and all those guys. And I didn't realize it. I just recorded what they told me. That was all I was interested in. And then with Colonel Corso, I had been warned off him. They told me to stop talking about Corso when I moved back into the United States. Well, it's out there, like, who cares? I'm convinced that very few people care. And when I was working on Trinity, and I was about to go to question Sabrina Wajak in LA, she got a call that said, Paola Harris is not coming. We're going to take care of this. And I'm wondering who we are going to take care of this. And just before Clifford Stone died, confessing all the dangerous stuff, but 2 weeks before he died, 2 men in black vans went up to his door and said, "We came here to collect your files. Paola Harris sent us." Well, of course, that isn't true. So God bless him. Clifford took a gun and said, "No, Paola Harris did not send you." So that caused a problem for me. I didn't know who the 2 guys in the black vans were, but I had to make sure that right after he died, just like with Remy and so forth, that we could box up those files and get them to Rice University. So we boxed up 23 boxes, thanks to his friend from Bulgaria. We boxed them up and sent them to Rice. So there's archives of Clifford Stones at Rice. There's John Max, there's Whitley Strieber's, there's Wendell Stevens, there's me. All this stuff is at Rice. I don't think they know what they have because they don't know the stories, but all this stuff is now at Rice University. And those are the cases that I can remember of possible danger, but that's not, I don't even think about that, I'm of the opinion, Michael, you're going to laugh, that really nobody cares. It doesn't matter to the average person, so I'm just doing historical stuff.
Well, I think it is very important for people that are now starting to pay attention to this, and they're wanting to dig deeper into what is the backstory, what has really happened, that it goes much further than just the 2004 Tic Tac sighting off the coast of San Diego. That there's a big history here. Now you've written, I don't know, is it about a dozen books now, and a lot of those books have your recorded interviews with quite a few of the people that we've been talking about. So where do people go to find your books, Paola?
Well, the ones that we've been talking about now, Trinity is on Amazon, Conversations with Colonel Corso. I have just released, I think, the most complete book. It's brand new, updated, because it has the daughter of Kenneth Arnold. I'm the only journalist that ever interviewed her. And it has Jacques Vallée in there, and that's called Connecting the Dots, Making Sense of the UFO Phenomenon. It has Hynek, it has Monsignor Balducci, it has everybody that I interviewed, especially when I was in Europe. And How Do You Speak to a Ball of Light is another one I did. I did the Dan Burge case. I did the Charles Hall case. And Stargate to a New Reality is another book that I did. And I don't know whether the Dan Burge, by the way, that's another interesting case, a man who worked at S4. And I have to laugh. I really have to laugh to share with you, because on social media, there's this picture of Bob Lazar and it says, "I told you so." I'm going, yeah. To me, and I had gone to the little alien inn and I had spoken to his mother-in-law. So I talked to the families of these people. And I was thinking to myself, most people just have an opinion based on nothing. They don't read the interviews. They don't know the people. They just have this opinion. No, Bob Lazar's lying and so forth and whatever. Billy Meyer, don't even go there. Jaime Maussan just told me he redigitalized and went back to Billy Meyer to do some work. And I'm going, America will never see it. What a shame. I went to see Billy Meyer in Schmidt-Rudi in Switzerland. All of these things that are so important that people just blew off. They blow them off without going there or checking on it or anything, are coming up to light. And I have to thank you, Michael, for looking at the historical angle of this and for realizing that disclosure came before 2023.
Yes, well, it's happened many decades ago. I mean, you definitely have been on the cutting edge of finding these whistleblowers and contactees and bringing their testimony into the public arena. You've got about a dozen books that people can find, and also you teach courses. The Exopolitics Institute has a certificate program and a diploma program, and so I think you teach about 4 or 5 courses
5, yeah.
as part of that. And so do you want to tell us about what you're teaching? I think the next semester begins in early September. So what course are you going to be teaching next September?
Well, it's quantum. I think it's called quantum disclosure, and it's basically when I was talking to Edgar Mitchell and he told me about his epiphany, and then he started talking about quantum physics and how he had noetic sciences and Dean Radin and so forth. I thought we should look at the scientific part and how it leads to consciousness. And I'm going to tell everybody right now, I've done all the data work. I probably won't do that kind of work again. I'm kind of graduated to consciousness research. So quantum cosmology talks about what Edgar Mitchell told me about looking at everything being connected in his experience in space. But it also, I think quantum cosmology talks about what other whistleblowers and what people like looking at the Mars situation, other people that have come and connected dots and connected it with a spirituality of some kind or a raising of consciousness. I remember, so that course I think is 106. I told you that I would do the human type alien course too, the Cosmic Brother course, which is my favorite of all, because I have details from all over the world of contact. But I think we're coming to a point where I had this conversation with Jacques Vallée, which is really incredibly deep, about the reason for sightings, the reason for contact. And it is to get your attention. And when they get your attention, your whole life, it changes. And Jacques has his thoughts about it being a simulation. And it's very interesting, because if this is about consciousness, then I got to get off the data stuff that I've been doing and start to switch over into consciousness. So I just did a show out of Japan. And I plan on, I think, going to Japan and talking about consciousness. But in the meantime, the Exopolitics Institute has legitimate courses you can take for a certificate. And my students are amazing. And they're from all over the world, all over the world.
So yeah, people can go to exopoliticsinstitute.org to learn more about the Institute's certificate program, the different courses that are taught. I think we have about 10 courses now that are available to get a certificate and diploma. You're one of the key instructors. And Paola, I just want to kind of acknowledge the incredible work you've done. I mean, you've been working in this field from 1979. It was a labor of love at the beginning and continues to be a labor of love. Also, living life on the bleeding edge sometimes. We've all experienced that. You too. So just want to kind of thank you for your dedication to this field, for bringing out all of these incredible whistleblower testimonies. More recently, you're bringing out a lot of contactee testimonies. That's wonderful. And so, yeah, I think you're a national treasure. And I hope people go visit your site, paolaharris.com, and kind of like support your work and buy your books and register for your courses and just get the word out. So I want to thank you, Paola, for being on Exopolitics today.
No, thank you for asking me, Michael.
You have been listening to Exopolitics today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.